You've had 2 responses to your survey, and they were your mum and your best mate. No one wants to partake in a semi-structured interview with you, and you've got no takers for your focus group. Yeah, sucks, doesn't it? Because you worked really hard on your recruitment materials, you busted an absolute guts to get them ready. You sent them off to the ethics committee, who requested like 78 changes to them. You found a way to get incentive vouchers for your participants, and that was not easy. It required the filling in of a lot of forms. I get it, I really do. You're out there fishing for participants and no one is biting. And you're not going to like what I've got to say next. I'm sorry to break this to you, but your participant recruitment materials are rubbish. Your poster, your email, your carefully crafted Facebook post, people have taken one look at that and gone, nah. But don't worry, we are going to take your rubbish recruitment materials and turn them into accessible, relatable calls to action that have people wanting to actually participate in your research projects. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, and I've spent the last 20 years working as an academic in UK universities. Now, in that time, I have seen some rubbish recruitment materials, and I have written some rubbish recruitment materials. So I know what they shouldn't look like, but I also know what they should look like, and that's what I'm going to teach you in this video. Firstly, we're going to be looking at why most research recruitment materials are rubbish. Secondly, we're going to look at how you can make a genuine connection with your potential participants. After that, you'll learn how you can explain your research in a way that makes sense to everyday people. Then we'll see how we can get people on board and get them to care as much about your research as you do, at the same time as easing any anxieties that they might have about taking part. We'll then move on to look at how you can refine your materials using some design hacks and also through testing them properly on real humans. And finally, visibility. How can you get your research recruitment materials in front of your potential participants? It's actually not as difficult as you think. Right then, let's get into it. So firstly, why most research recruitment materials are rubbish. Well, we've got to think about how they're produced and where they come from. So they're written by you, they're checked by your supervisors, and they're approved by an ethics committee. And if you've pilot tested them at all, you've probably done that with your fellow students. Now, the one thing that all of these people have in common is that they are all academic. They are all within a college or a university, a scholarly institution. And the trouble is, when people have been in an academic institution for several years or several decades, they tend to pick up their own kind of language. They start using terms that people outside of that environment don't really understand. They start talking in ways that people outside really don't get. And they're not deliberately trying to be exclusionary or snobby. They've just come to talk in that particular way, and very often they don't even realise that they're doing it. So when you've been a social science student for a few years, you are beginning to pick up on this stuff. You are beginning to emulate that. And when it comes to your research recruitment materials, you've seen other people's research recruitment materials. You've seen the posters up around campus. You've seen the posts on social media. And you kind of get to a point where you think that that is how your materials need to look. And you try and imitate that. You try and mimic that. You just think that that is what research recruitment materials are supposed to look like. But if you're wanting to do research with people outside of that academic environment, they are not going to understand that language. They're going to come across terms like semi-structured interview or thematic analysis in your recruitment materials, and they're going to be like, what the hell is that? And to be honest, when they're thinking those things, when they're seeing words that they don't understand and you haven't taken the time to explain them, you haven't communicated what you're doing in a particularly accessible way, you've kind of lost them already. So what can you do about that? Well, you can make the effort to make a genuine connection with your participants. And to do that, you've got to put yourself in their shoes. Unfortunately, when we've got to get our fieldwork done, when we need to have responses to those questionnaires, when we really need to organise those interviews, sometimes we can take our eye off the ball when it comes to thinking about our participants and really understanding how it is that we can connect with them. We become quite selfish. It's all like me, me, me. I've got to get my responses in. I need to get these interviews organised. It's this kind of impatient sort of 5-year-old, I want it and I want it now kind of mindset. And at this point in your research, there is the danger that it can become all about you. And in doing that, you're going to alienate potential participants. And you can inadvertently come across as a bit needy and a bit desperate when you're trying to get those responses and get those interviews or whatever it is you're doing organised. And in the process of really feeling that pressure to get your responses in, to get those interviews organised, to do whatever it is you're trying to do, you can lose sight of your participants. As I said, it all kind of becomes about you, and you lose track of why it is that you're doing this research in the first place. And often our motivations are that we genuinely care about the people that we want to research with. We genuinely have an interest in finding out about their experiences and their thoughts and their feelings and all of that kind of stuff. But when we're in recruitment panic mode, all of that kind of goes out the window. So we need to reconnect with the people that we're trying to do research with at this point in time. We need to think about the things that matter to them. Their struggles, their problems, their challenges, their thoughts and their beliefs and their opinions. And we need to put that stuff into our recruitment materials. We need to reach out and connect with our participants by using the language that they use. And sometimes that means using their actual words. We need to use the words and the phrases that they use in our recruitment materials. Because often the words and the phrases that our potential participants use to talk about their lives and their experiences are not the words and the phrases that we as academics use. So, for example, if you're doing research on anxiety, you might find that your potential participants do not use the word anxiety to talk about how they're feeling. They might use terms like worried about. But I know what you're going to say. You're going to be like, well, how do I know what words and phrases and terms they're using to describe their experiences when I haven't even done my research with them yet? Well, thankfully, because of the internet, there are a lot of ways of finding out. Go and find some Facebook groups where people are talking about the issues that you're interested in researching. Go and find books on Amazon that your potential participants might be reading and have a look at the reviews for those books, because there is absolute gold in those reviews. People often talk about the ways in which the book helped them, the ways in which it didn't help them, things that are missing, things that they change, things that they like to be different. So please do go and have a look in there, because you'll find some really helpful stuff. There might also be a particular subreddit where people are discussing the things that you're interested in. So go and have a look on there as well. Lastly, use the power of Google. Search for what it is you're interested in and then scroll down to look at the people also asked and related searches parts of the search results. There is some really helpful stuff in there. So make a note of everything you find. And when it comes to actually including this stuff in your research recruitment materials, you might want to use some sentence starters like this. Next up, you need to explain your research in a way that actually makes sense to people. People outside of an academic environment, people who aren't used to using the kind of terminology that you as a social scientist have come to use. So to use the semi-structured interviews example again, you don't want to tell people that you'd like them to participate in a semi-structured interview with you, because they're going to be like, what? Instead, you might want to say to them, I'm doing a piece of research on this topic and I'd be really interested to talk to you about your experiences. It really is that simple. Also, make sure that you don't overwhelm your potential participants and bombard them with so much information that you scare them away. Save all of the officialdom about ethics and consent forms and all of that stuff until the next stage of this person getting involved in your study. You don't need that on your recruitment poster or on your social media post, because people are just going to be like, oh my goodness, how much stuff? You can get to that later. You've got to think about what you're trying to achieve with your research recruitment materials, like your poster, like your social media post. The aim is not to tell people absolutely everything about the research in that particular post. It's to say, okay, here's what the research is about, here's how you could get involved, and then invite them to want to come and find out more. If they're interested, that's when you introduce all of the official stuff. And next up, we've got to do just that. We've got to get people on board. We've got to get people to the next stage. And that involves convincing them to care as much about the research as we do. Part of that means easing any anxieties that they might have about getting involved in it. So how do we get people on board in this way? How do we get them to care as much about our research as we do? And at this point, we've got to avoid all of those go-to things that we come across in all of the research recruitment materials that we see. So people talk about, this will enable me to complete my master's degree, or this will enable me to complete my PhD, or this will generally provide some insights into this thing. People don't care about that. People care about what people care about. So you need to go back and you need to look at what you found when you were doing your research on the struggles and the challenges and the thoughts and the feelings of your participants, and you've got to appeal to those things. Exactly what struggles and frustrations and problems is your research going to help address? And how's that going to affect them? We're essentially asking the so what question here, because that's the question that everybody has when they're thinking about whether to get involved in something or not. So what? So, say we might want to do a study about students' experiences of anxiety in higher education. And if we think about students with anxiety, why should they care about your study? What kind of things are you going to do after your study? What is this study going to result in? So, for example, you might want to launch some kind of awareness raising campaign among staff who work in HE. You might say that you're going to go to the university management team with a list of recommendations that have emerged from your study. So you've got to communicate to your potential participants why they should care about your research. And that involves connecting with them in terms of something that's going to come out of your research that is good for them, that is beneficial for them, that is going to change or transform their lives in some way. Now, if you've done all of the things that I've suggested so far in your research recruitment materials, your materials are probably better than most people's, okay? They are going to be standing out. So if somebody was stood in front of a poster board and your poster was there and some bog standard recruitment posters were also there, they would go straight to yours. They'd be like, well, that is the piece of research that I want to participate in. However, people might not be 100% bought into it just yet. And one of the things that a lot of research recruitment materials really don't do is to address people's anxieties, people's worries about getting involved in a piece of research. People are often a bit hesitant and they have questions, so it's your responsibility to address those. A really good way of reassuring any potential participants is to direct them to some reviews from people who've already participated in your research. So when you do your pilot study, when you test out your materials, make sure that you're asking the people who do that for you to give you some feedback in terms of how they felt beforehand, how they felt afterwards, anything that they were worried or anxious about in terms of participating in this pilot study. So things like this would actually be really reassuring for potential participants. The next thing you need to do is refine your materials by using some design hacks and then test them out on real people. You need to make your research materials eye-catching. They need to stand out because there's an awful lot of noise out there, isn't there? Even if you're just putting up a poster on a university notice board, there are a lot of other posters on there, aren't there? And if you're putting something on social media, well, there's a lot of noise on there as well. So you really need to make your stuff stand out. So use some bright colours, use some fonts that are going to catch people's eye. Make sure that it's the kind of thing that people aren't just going to scroll right past. Your aim is not to blend in here, it's to stand out. So don't try and imitate or mimic what other people are doing. Make your materials incredibly different. Use graphic design tools like Canva. This stuff does not need to cost you any money. There is a really good free version of Canva, which is perfectly adequate for your purposes. Also, think about how you can make it easy for your participants. So rather than including an email address or a phone number or that kind of thing on your materials, maybe have a QR code that directs them to another page where there's some more information about your research. You've got to do everything you can to reduce the friction between somebody seeing your poster and somebody actually getting involved in your research project. So the easier you can make it for them, the better. Also, don't forget to include a photo of yourself on your poster or on your materials somewhere, because that way people can see that there is a real human being behind this research. You're not some faceless researcher. They can actually see the whites of your eyes. And don't worry if you're a little bit camera shy or you're kind of lacking in confidence a little bit, because you can use a little filter. So include a photograph of yourself and put a little filter on it if you want to. Just don't go too crazy with that. And when you've designed these lovely recruitment materials, you need to test them out on someone who is going to be honest with you about them. That might be a friend or a family member, but please make sure that this person is someone who is not going to be afraid to be critical of them. So you don't want to go and show them to somebody who just tells you that everything you do all the time is wonderful. So you need someone who's going to be critical and honest. And that person for me was always my late father, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. He always used to give me his honest opinion when I would show him my research recruitment materials. And he'd look through them and he would tell me what didn't make sense. He'd be like, I don't understand this, I don't understand that. And when I first started showing my stuff to him, I used to get really frustrated with him about it. I'd be like, well, why don't you understand that? Like, oh, honestly. But I soon came to realise that this kind of feedback is really important, because it's your job as a researcher to actually explain things to people properly. And by getting that feedback from my dad in those early days, and he was very patient with me when he was doing this, it really did help me understand that. Oh, God bless you, Dad. Now, last up, visibility. Your materials need to be where your potential participants are going to see them. Now, this sounds quite obvious, but sometimes it involves thinking quite creatively, because often the places where we think people are going to see stuff become the places that people stop looking at. So, notice boards. I mean, how often do you see people actually standing looking at a notice board in a corridor? Not very often. We don't want our materials to be in places where people are just going to walk past them or scroll past them. So how do we get past this? So in terms of things like a physical poster, think about the times when people are going to stop and actually look at the things that are around them. In the queue for coffee, waiting for the lift, at the water fountain, on the toilet. The back of a toilet door can sometimes be quite an effective place to put your research poster. But in terms of those physical posters, please make sure that you have permission to put them where you're going to put them. Now, in terms of social media, you also need to think creatively here as well. I think too many students fall into the trap of thinking, well, I'm just going to post once on social media. I'm just going to put this thing on Twitter or put this thing on Facebook, and then I'm going to just sit back and wait for my participants to just come rolling in. Well, that doesn't happen. Very often you've got to post something multiple times before somebody is going to see it, before they're going to engage with it. Only a tiny proportion of the people who follow us on social media see our posts. So just putting something out there once is not going to be enough. And you need to think about the times when people are going to be on social media as well. So posting something at like 10 o'clock in the morning is probably not going to be very effective if people are busy at that time. So think about the times when your potential participants are actually going to be looking at their phones or on their laptops, and post accordingly. And also, don't discount things like paid ads as well. I know that quite a few students have used Facebook ads, and they've used them quite effectively to target specific people, specific audiences for their research. So that might be something you might want to look into. All of the things that I've shared with you in this video are not just going to be beneficial for your recruitment, for your study. They're going to help you beyond that as well, because all of these things teach you how to be a good communicator. They're really good at helping you understand the needs of the people that you want to serve. They're the kind of things that are going to make you really good at your job, whatever you go on to do. And yeah, that's it. So go and sort out your recruitment materials, and I will see you next week.